Hello, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are unpacking a really fascinating theological text that tackles one of the most profound human struggles out there, the purpose of suffering. We're going to be looking at a deeply personal argument titled Temporal Trials and the Eternal Weight of Glory. If you've ever found yourself wondering how believers actually reconcile immense earthly hardship with their faith, well, you're in the right place. This explainer is going to lay out exactly how the source text approaches that very heavy question.
Okay, let's dive into this. We're going to break this down into 4 clear parts. First, we'll look at the unexpected fire. Then, we'll heavily focus on everything the Lord said. After that, we'll break down purpose in the fire. And finally, we'll weigh it all out in the eternal weight.
Right off the bat, the source material forces us to confront a major, central dilemma. Why do believers face fiery trials? You know, it's a question that really matters whether you're deeply rooted in a faith or if you're just observing from the outside looking in. I mean, if someone is doing everything right, why is their path still filled with such intense hardship? Let's see exactly how the text addresses this. That brings us to section 1, the unexpected fire, where the text examines the huge gap between expectation and reality.
And this brilliantly illustrates the sharp contrast the speaker draws. Think about it. Many people give their lives to Christ fully expecting that stepping onto the narrow way means instant bliss. You know, just continuous happiness from there on out. But the reality, it's often the exact opposite. It's the beginning of a life filled with continuous fiery trials and tests. The text strongly argues that the Christian walk just isn't a bypass around suffering. It's actually a direct path right through the middle of it. To make this super concrete, the speaker shares a pretty vivid anecdote from back in 2012. Right after giving their life to Christ, a fellow believer shared a vision with them. And the vision was essentially this: walking down a long road, continuously facing giants. You defeat one, and guess what? More are just waiting right around the corner. But the key here was the response. It wasn't fear. It was actively calling upon the fire of Jesus to consume those giants. The text uses this story to emphasize that these trials aren't some sort of cosmic mistake. They are literally the terrain of the narrow way itself.
Moving into section 2. Everything the Lord said. We're looking at specific scriptural promises and warnings here. Now, I want to emphasize that this section is really the absolute core of the entire text. It anchors everything on what the source says God specifically spoke regarding suffering.
So the crucial point is that hardship shouldn't catch a believer off guard. The text leans heavily on 1 Peter chapter 4, urging believers literally not to be surprised by fiery trials. Because let's be honest, when hardship hits, Christians so often immediately question if they've done something wrong to deserve it, but this scripture is used by the author to argue that fiery trials are a totally normal, totally guaranteed part of the process. According to the source, they aren't strange in the slightest. The argument then expands by bringing in 1 John 2:17, which highlights this really fascinating dual perspective. Normally, when we hear about things passing away, we automatically think it's a warning about losing worldly wealth or fleeting pleasures, right? But, surprisingly, the speaker points out that this applies to the negative things too. Earthly pain, frustration, the deepest trials, they are just as temporary as the wealth. Absolutely everything in this world has an expiration date.
So, because these trials are entirely guaranteed and entirely temporary, how is a believer supposed to react? Well, the source turns to James 1 for a completely counterintuitive instruction. Count it all joy. Now, that sounds wild on paper, but the text argues that believers should continue to rejoice and glorify the Lord even while they are actively praying for deliverance rather than turning their backs or accusing God of abandoning them.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how Paul's writing in 2 Corinthians sets up a profound contrast. The speaker frames all earthly suffering as a light affliction that is but for a moment. Even if a trial lasts an entire human lifetime, the text argues it is just a tiny, momentary speck when you put it on the scale against the massive, infinite, eternal weight of glory that is actively being worked out for the believer.
All right, that brings us to section 3, purpose in the fire, and how the text says God actually utilizes this suffering.
Let's move to and see how this builds, because according to the text, suffering isn't just allowed randomly for the sake of it. There is a deeply intentional divine mechanism at play here. Step 1, the believer falls into unexpected trials. This forces step 2, which is learning a deep, real dependence on the Lord. That builds right into step 3, perfecting endurance. And ultimately, this entire grueling sequence is perfectly designed for step 4, preparing the believer for eternal glory.
The speaker gets incredibly candid here about their own difficult, lifelong trials.
They share openly that their life has been far from easy. But, looking back, they claim to see exactly what the fire accomplishes. It humbles you. It strips away the worthless things from your life. It teaches true patience. It forces you to wait on the Lord, and it demands complete, total surrender. The speaker admits that without going through these really intense trials, they wouldn't be nearly as serious about their faith as they are today.
And this realization brings us to a really powerful conclusion from the source. The speaker admits very honestly that there were times they totally despaired, feeling hopeless and wondering if Jesus was even listening to them. But through the lens of hindsight, they testify that God was working for their good the entire time. So what you should take away from this is that, according to the text, the goodness of God is often hidden deep inside the trial itself.
Which leads us into our fourth and final section, the eternal wait. This is all about weighing the fleeting present against the infinite future.
The text summarizes this entire theological framework with a really stark contrast. On the one hand, you have the temporal. That's everything seen, felt, and experienced right here on earth. Remember, even a lifelong trial is finite. It eventually ends. On the other hand, you have the eternal. These are the unseen promises, the ultimate salvation of the soul and infinite glory. The text essentially pleads with its audience to keep their focus strictly locked on the eternal side of the scale.
To really drive this home, the speaker introduces a concept that I think is incredibly striking: the expiration date. The text states as an absolute, unbreakable truth that there is no earthly trial, literally no matter how heavy or severe it is, that does not have an expiration date. Stepping into eternity, walking through those final doors at the end of your life, is the absolute guaranteed expiration date for all suffering. Earthly pain simply cannot cross that threshold. And because of that absolute expiration date, the speaker delivers a very stark warning. Don't let temporal pain rob you of something eternal. The text points out what it views as the ultimate tragedy. Imagine enduring a terrible, lifelong trial, but letting that pain cause you to turn your back on Christ, only to step into an eternity separated from God. The argument they make is crystal clear. Trading your eternal salvation just to escape a temporary trial makes absolutely zero sense.
To model this kind of unshakable faith, the text brings up the famous biblical story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, these guys were facing a literal fiery furnace, and their stance was absolute. Even if God chooses not to deliver us from this immediate fire, we are still not going to bow down to an idol. The speaker uses them as the ultimate blueprint for believers today. The message is to maintain your faith, whether earthly deliverance comes tomorrow or whether it doesn't come until eternity.
Finally, the text leaves us with a massive, echoing question. What shall it profit a man to gain the whole world but lose his soul? If all earthly things, the absolute greatest joys and the deepest, darkest pains are just a passing speck of dust in the grand scheme of forever, it really forces us to ask ourselves, where exactly are we putting our focus? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep weighing your present against your infinite future. Catch you next time.